Hi,
Hello,
Tony.
hello. Hi.
It's so great to meet you. Um, Tony McMahon, you are an investigative journalist. You've also just written a book and you think you know who Jack the Ripper really was.
Yes, I
Is that
do.
true?
Yes, I
Ah,
do. Yeah. It all actually came from doing I was involved in a TV show for history. Can I mention them? And history
yeah.
channel. And we were just looking at this American suspect, Francis Tumblety, who's been long recognized as a potential suspect. And just in the course of my research, I obviously found out all the stuff about him being interrogated by Scotland Yard in 1888. But what I then discovered was that he was arrested 25 years earlier as a suspect in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I thought,
Wow.
absolutely crazy. I mean, how can this same man be involved in two of the greatest crimes, basically, of the 19th century? And went down to the British Library, started looking at all the newspapers going back, throughout that time. And what I discovered was he was a kind of celebrity quack doctor, he was like a bit like a social media influencer in our own time. Everybody knew him. He was a completely over the top character. Didn't hide anything. Very obviously gay, and I'm LGBT myself. But this isn't a case of, oh, I'm reading something into his life. He liked men. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. Which of course raises interesting questions about why he was arrested as a Jack the Ripper suspect. But yeah, he was implicated in these two crimes and other crimes. So the more I read about him, the more I thought, well, this guy has a lot of explaining to do at the very least.
Absolutely. When did he come over from America?
Well, the thing is, he was originally born in Dublin, so he had family over. He had family in Ireland and in Liverpool and Scotland. Like a lot of Irish families. I mean, I'm half Irish as well myself, and I understand. There's Irish diaspora obviously across America, but also in Britain. So he had emigrated as a teenager from Dublin to America, but then he came over to Europe quite a lot, but with increasing frequency for whatever reason towards the end of his life. And then he decided to live in Liverpool for a while, where he was had up on a manslaughter charge. And
Oh,
then he came to London, where he was implicated as Jack the Ripper. Um,
Oh, wow. So he's just generally like just killing people, huh?
well, I think there's a manslaughter case very early in his medical career. And I say that because he was a herb doctor. He was essentially a quack doctor, although the line between orthodox and unorthodox medicine was a bit more blurred at the time. But there was a case where he was accused of killing a patient as early as the 1850s in Canada, what's now Canada. And he basically tried to steal the man's organs from the mortuary. And then when that was found out, he got on a horse and rode across the border.
oh,
So from a very early stage in his life, he's being accused of killing, basically. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
gosh.
That's
Wow.
amazing.
Why do you think they kept him why do you think they sort of covered it up? Do you think it's because he was a bit of a celebrity, do you think?
Well, I think he knew. I think he knew how to use his celebrity, certainly as a way of kind of networking, in high society. And he definitely had a lot of rich clients. He made repeat fortunes. There's details in the news. I went through all the newspaper reports, every report I could find on him for decades. And it's very clear he had a lot of money in the bank. Journalists were always intrigued by this. So he had a lot of money, rich clients. But I think he had Irish networks for sure that he played on a lot. And I think as well, look, as a man would have had to operate in the shadows as a gay man at that time, I'm sure he also was networked, through what would have been informal, what we now call gay networks. But I think men of a similar outlook, because you can see he's sometimes dragged into court and somebody very powerful turns up to get him off the hook. In one case, mayor of Cincinnati, and in another case, the District Attorney of New York. In what are really sordid court cases you think any politician would want to avoid, but they get him off the hook.
Good heaven.
I mean, it's always been going on, hasn't it, Dee, all of these things. What
Yeah.
I found fascinating about the whole thing, though, is you said he kept popping back and forwards to Europe. That wasn't so easy to do in the 1800s, was it?
No, well, I mean, when he's arrested as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, and he puts up a big amount of money as bail, and so he's not put behind bars, and he jumps bail, and he basically now you get on a plane and you'd be gone. He has to literally go down to the coast, get on a ship to France, get on a ship from France to New York. And by the time he gets to New York, all the local newspapers are waiting for him because they've all heard about it. They're just sitting there on the dockside going, oh, here he comes. There's no surprise.
Oh,
So, but he gets away with it. He's never extradited. And he's covered time and time again. But yeah, I mean, it was horseback and ships basically to get from one place to another.
far more romantic.
But slow.
Nat, what were you going to say?
No, I was just thinking of, how everything is so different now with DNA and oh my goodness, it's just been one of those fascinating conundrums that people have been fascinated by for years and years and years, and yet you might have just stumbled on something. I mean, has it been suspected in the past, or is this just something? Did you have that light bulb moment when you just thought, oh my God, they are so connected? What happened?
Well, in the 1990s, a letter was discovered, which was written about at the time, where a retired Scotland Yard detective wrote to a very famous retired crime journalist. And I mentioned this at the end, basically saying we all thought it was Tumblety. It's just that he fled. The only reason they didn't pursue him in the end was there was another murder after he left, but that's not now regarded as one of the so-called canonical murders. So it was regarded as a Jack the Ripper murder at the time, and then everybody thought, well, it can't be Tumblety, he's gone. Now it's not regarded as a canonical murder. So the 5 women who we normally regard as Jack the Ripper's victims, they were all murdered while Tumblety was in London. So I think at the time he was let go on a false premise, and now I think the evidence for him being at least a very plausible suspect is very strong. I mean, he's there, he's arrested, he's been found guilty or at least implicated in other killings, and he has a criminal record as long as you don't know what, for gross indecency and fraud and goodness knows what.
Is it a gay man's? No, I know this sounds ridiculous, but
No.
you know how they have a sort of profile of murderers. Do gay men kill prostitutes?
Well, this is the thing that's really interesting about Tumblety, because I think, we've had to reevaluate, in recent decades, the idea of, bad gays. I mean, there's even a book that came out last year called Bad Gays.
Right.
And I think gay people have always known what gay people are capable of. We're not all saints, that's for certain. But there are interesting elements to the Tumblety story. For example, one of the reasons Scotland Yard held on to him as a suspect was they conferred with American police, who first of all said that he'd been saying for years that he'd been married to a woman he discovered was a prostitute, and after that he swore off women forever. He was renowned for his misogynistic views, but also at his dinner parties, he would take everybody from the dinner table to another room. He would open up this cabinet of curiosities, and inside were glass jars with women's uteruses. And that was his party piece. And when Scotland Yard heard that, they thought, well, hang on, look at Annie Chapman, for example, one of the victims. What was missing? Her rings and her uterus, ditto Kelly. And people began to wonder, is this guy as well because he's a frustrated medic, and he was looked down on by surgeons, by, respectable doctors. I wonder, and I consider this in the book, was he carrying out in a frenzied state some kind of impromptu surgery? Was this kind of medical frustration at work? Because it was done in a very methodical way. There's something almost quite OCD about the way Jack the Ripper operated. He goes through this ritual with each woman. In fact, the only time he murders 2 women in one night is when he's interrupted in one of the murders and then goes to commit the second one because he hasn't got the whole ritual performed. So I'm wondering if Tumblety, who, by the way, was not well mentally or physically, I think he had syphilis, by the way, by this stage.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it gets worse. And
Wow.
I think he was performing some kind of medical ritual on these poor women, who encountered him in the dead of night. The evidence for Queen Victoria's son is pretty weak, and some of the others who didn't actually resort to stabbing or By the way, I've lots of police sirens going by outside. There's nothing to do with the story. This is South London. But, you know, their modus operandi was not stabbing. But with Tumblety, we have a man who, you know, is this frustrated medic. He's been done. By the way, there were 2 manslaughter charges. There was that one I mentioned where he stole the organs. There's another one in Liverpool where he's accused of killing a patient not long before the Ripper killings. And he gets off that. Now, I think he bribed people in certain instances to, you know, to get off these cases. What I should also say, when he gets back to New York, guess what happens? There's a copycat Ripper killing in Manhattan.
No.
Yeah. And, you know, and of course, journalists point a finger at him and they begin to ask questions about previous murders in America. There was a series of murders in Texas called the Servant Girl Annihilator murders. And Tumblety had a valet who is called Jack the Texan. I kid you not. And the journalists in America begin to say, hang on a moment, has this guy had a trial run in Texas in the early 1880s with this Jack the Texan guy who is still his valet when he's then in London in 1888? Or is he even getting Jack the Texan to carry out the murders for him because Jack the Texan is a younger, allegedly, journalists at the time say, a sinister character? So is he kind of directing this guy to commit the murders? And all that is speculated, by the way, in the newspapers at the time. And forgotten since.
Good heavens. But I suppose that's the thing about social media nowadays. I suppose, you know, he would have been arrested and that's it. But, you know, the bribery and corruption, especially, still goes on.
I'm sure it still goes on.
Yeah.
You know, an awful lot. I mean, if you had a case of all the cases in the world that you could reopen, which one would you do you think?
I mean, I think the Jack the Ripper case is just the one. It is the one that just, I mean, so it's just, it's so fascinating. And I mean, I have some of the old newspapers here from that year and copies of Punch from that year where the police were ridiculed in London for being absolutely useless and hopeless.
It hasn't changed, has it?
Hasn't changed. And in fact, there's a fascinating letter I found in a copy of the Times from the time from a suffragette, an early suffragette, Frances Power Cobb, where she actually says, why don't you police hire women to investigate this case who can go and talk to other women in Whitechapel who now know who Jack the Ripper is? You know, because at that time, of course, the police didn't employ women as detectives. And I think that was, you know, there's so many fascinating angles, you know.
How did you start in journalism? How did that begin for you?
Well, I actually began life as a print journalist. I was a news editor at Financial Times magazines, and I used to freelance for Nationals in the 90s. And then I went from print journalism. I don't think you can do this anymore, but I went from what was pure print journalism, pre-digital, lots of drinking and, you know, getting people drunk to get stories and all that sort of thing. That's how it all worked in those days, 30 years ago. I then went into TV and I was a news producer at the BBC for several years. And, you know, I've just carried on writing ever since. I mean, I you know, went into all sorts of things, public relations and so on, as journalists tend to, because it's paid better. One of the things I look at in the book, you know, Tumblety talks about having intimate relations with all sorts of people, including the Secretary of State, William Seward, and then talks about his intimate relationship with Abraham Lincoln. And of course, Abraham Lincoln has been, you know, it's been said that he had 4 or 5 male lovers. Joshua Speed, his head of security, Derrickson. And I kind of touch on that because, you know, at the time, and I'm talking about in the 19th century, people talked about this. In fact, I think we got kind of prudish in the middle of the 20th century, you know, the kind of McCarthy era and Hayes Code and so on. And we seem to come back out of that. So I sometimes it feels like the 19th century, 1920s, say up to then, we were much more open about sexuality. Then we went through a very buttoned up 1940s, 1950s. And we started coming out of that in the 1960s. So we're a bit more like that than, you know, a kind of gradient upwards in terms of tolerance and understanding. But, you know, Tumblety is written about very obviously as being a gay man by journalists at the time. And it's unavoidable because he runs into trouble with these young men that he employs as valets. They steal from him. He then takes them to court. They then accuse him of abuse in court to get off the charges. And this happens over, and I detail it in the book because I found all the cases in the newspapers. He's tailed by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. who are always on his case for gross indecency. And by the way, when he's arrested as a Jack the Ripper suspect in London in 1888, he's actually arrested, first of all, for gross indecency with 4 men. It's only when Scotland Yard start looking at him and then talking to the police, they went, oh, hang on a moment, we've got Jack the Ripper. So he's actually arrested for gross indecency with men first, and the Ripper charges come after.
Wow.
Amazing. This is incredible. Tony, so how can we get hold of your book?
It is on Amazon, Waterstones, W.H. Smith, etc., now, but
Right.
for pre-order at the time of recording, as we always have to say. But
Yes.
obviously, a gilt-edged copy will be sent to your good souls. Writing this, if it had just been if it just been a kind of a hunch built up and built, which some of the stories about Jack the Ripper clearly are, I'd have kind of lost interest, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it was like every decade that I went through the newspapers, another load of skeletons fell out, basically with Tumblety. And even in the last years, where I thought, oh, there won't be anything on him here. He goes back to New York, surely keeps his head down now. No, he's up in court for an assault on a young man very quick soon afterwards, which is what the district attorney of New York then inexplicably turns up to get him off that case. There's then a murder of a woman, sex worker called Carrie Brown, which is completely Ripper-esque. I mean, it's horrific. And then and I was also then investigating how his syphilis was clearly getting worse. He was going to a health resort, which was well known for being a syphilis cure resort, basically. And by the way, when he dies, he's got an extraordinary amount of money in the bank, which is fought over by his family for years. Every time he's arrested, he's got loads of diamonds on him. He carries diamonds and cash around with him. And do
you think he was in a blackmail? Do you think he was like a blackmaily situation? Because we don't know all the stories,
No.
intimate details of all the Jeffrey Epstein things, but people think that there was an awful lot of blackmaily thing. I mean, in those days, obviously there wouldn't have been cameras, but maybe he had something on all these people.
Or he was being blackmailed himself. But I think, yes, definitely. I think there's got to have been, he's definitely getting protected, as you say, because I would imagine he'd have a file.
He knew something on everybody.
On all these people. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, why on earth, to take that example, why does the district attorney of New York turn up in a courtroom where Tumblety has been accused at the small hours of the morning of getting into a fight with a rent boy on the streets, because this guy, it was over money or whatever, I mean, the man who was charging or whatever. They get into a fight, 2 police officers turn up, take them both. It's a sordid case that any politician would go, oh, keep me away from that. Instead, the district attorney is actually reported in the papers, turning up and saying, oh, no, I can vouch for Mr. Tumblety, he's fine. Well, why does he do that? And there are other examples of that. So I think you're right. I think he has definitely got, the files on certain people, but equally, he is definitely subjected to, kind of blackmail and, by certainly his young valets. I mean, there's one case where it ends up in court while he was in Europe. His valet, who was left to run the business in America, basically helps himself to Tumblety's investments and a load of bonds, railway bonds. And when Tumblety goes after him, he counter-strikes with his mother. They all end up in court, and Tumblety loses because the valet basically says, well, and he did this to me, and he did this to me, and he did this to me, and blah, blah. And I'm sure it's all true. I'm sure there was kind of sexual harassment, but Tumblety loses because obviously he's never going to win that case in that time. The moment you shout that accusation, you're finished in a Victorian court. End. And yet he gets himself into the same situation over and over and over again, and it's all documented by the police, by the Pinkertons. He ends up in court over and another young man, another young man, another young man, and because he can't stop cruising, he can't stop repeating the mistake of employing his young men that he's found, and then they do the same thing over and over.
And did he die from syphilis in the end?
Well, the cause of death is because he just walks into a hospital in St. Louis under a false name. The name he uses is the name that he used when he was accused of being Jack the Ripper, because he initially tried to hide his identity from Scotland Yard. So he walks into a hospital. They soon work out who he is. He looks like a tramp. The cause of death is a little bit obscure. They don't. They don't. But I think in those days, it's rather like with AIDS deaths in the 80s, where they put pneumonia.
Yeah.
I mean, we all remember that to save the family, basically. But he then dies, and that, of course, is then when they find all this cash and diamonds and God knows what else on him. But I think it's very likely he died of syphilis. I think his behavior patterns, as I detail in the book, he goes from being a very flamboyant, extrovert character. By the way, he processes down Main Street to promote his medical business, wearing a cavalry helmet, this cavalry uniform, on a
Wow.
horse, greyhounds. He always has his valets dressed as a Native American kid with feathers and everything, handing out, and he calls himself the Indian herb doctor. Anyway, that's claiming he's got Native American wisdom. But all of that sort of disappears. He becomes a darker, more sad figure. And I think this is the syphilis, taking hold of him. And you've got to remember, a lot of people have syphilis in those days. It's estimated, 10 to 20% of London had syphilis in the late Victorian period. I mean, it was just rampant. So it's not really. I mean, Lincoln had syphilis. Lincoln's wife had syphilis. I mean, she went insane with third degree. To be honest, if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, he'd have probably gone mad. His wife certainly did, Mary Todd Lincoln. And it's thought that John Wilkes Booth might have had syphilis. I think it was just, if you were promiscuous, it was pretty much a racing certainty you'd catch it at some stage. And of course, there's no cure. And
it was a horrible death, wasn't it?
Well, you go through those 3 stages, and the 3rd stage, yes. I mean, you could end up wearing a false nose, and your mind gone. I mean, my mother was a psychiatric nurse in one of the old asylums in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and they had a couple of people who were syphilitics who hadn't been cured and who had basically gone insane. As that's what happened in the old days.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And you can imagine how that would have fed his rage,
I was going to say that, not excusing him, but obviously it sort of enhanced it, didn't it?
Well, I think, he's got decades of being persecuted as a gay man. He's got decades of not being taken seriously as a doctor because he desperately wants to be recognized as a proper doctor. And then he's got this whole story, true or not, about, a prostitute and the evils of women. And his misogyny is well recorded in the newspapers and so on. So he's certainly a compelling suspect, if nothing else. He's in the right places at the right time, and he's got the right profile. I mean, I just think compared to some of the other suspects that are often held up, where the evidence is pretty slight, this was fun because I was able to footnote it to hell. It's all footnoted.
Oh my goodness! Oh, wait to read this book. It must be like a giant jigsaw.
What I was thinking we should have a Wonderbirds dinner party and invite the guests that we want to invite, and you'd definitely be one. I could just talk to you for hours.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I can eat. I can eat as well, by the way.
Excellent. Oh my goodness! Thank you, Tony, so much.
Thank you.
Coming on our show, and we're fascinated and can't wait to read it.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
And
it's been so lovely to meet you. I'd love to meet you in real life and go through your bookcase. That's all I'm interested in, really.
Absolutely.
I assure you, this is only the beginning.
Oh God. Must be like it looks like sort of like where Harry Potter is. You know what I mean? It's a kind of, isn't it, Harry Potter-esque sort of cave of books. Oh God. I've always thought if I was going to be held prisoner anywhere, it had to be in a bookshop.
Oh, I wouldn't be. Well, I sometimes think I am held prisoner in this room, but it's a good place to be incarcerated.
Yeah.
Oh,
definitely.
Thank you so much, darling. We'll see you again very soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Debbie.